Hello, my name is Amanda Hawthorne. I'm the coordinator for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion here at the British Council Teaching Centres in Spain. I have the immense honour of interviewing Inua Ellams, a literary force who cannot be easily categorised. He is a poet, performer, playwright, graphic artist, designer, founder of Midnight Run. Is there anything that I've missed off?
I'm really bad at basketball. I play basketball. That's it. I guess I organize walking tours through. I think you mentioned the Midnight Run, yes, and what else? I curate hip hop and poetry events as well. So I run. I'm also a programmer and a producer. A little bit, yeah.
Wow, amazingly talented. Thank you for joining us today. I have a question to start off with. What first motivated you to start writing?
My first writing motivations. Um, we ran into money difficulties when I was young. There wasn't much money around, and I spent the years before that just drawing and painting exclusively. And when money was too tight to afford painting materials, I started writing poetry because it was one way to still be creative with my fingers. So initially, poverty led me to writing, and then writing took over.
Well, okay. So you were imbued with a creative spirit that you just needed to get out in some way, in some form.
Yeah, I've been this way since I don't know, for as long as I remember, always making up things, stories, songs, drawings, paintings, blah, blah, blah. Yeah.
Okay. So making up things, your most recent play that's just finished to run, The Half God of Rainfall. Can you tell us about that, what it's about?
The Half God of Rainfall is an epic contemporary myth, mixing Greek mythology with Yoruba mythology to tell the story about a kid who's half the son of Zeus, half Nigerian mortal, whose powers manifest in the game of basketball. So it's a sort of cross-genre, cross-cultural epic that starts in a tiny grass basketball court in a village in Nigeria, in West Africa, goes to California in America, comes to the 2012 Olympics in London, then goes to Mount Olympus in Greece, where the story ends. So it's a huge, huge epic story about feminine revenge, about female solidarity, about love, and about basketball. Yeah.
It definitely is. Excuse me. It definitely is an epic. I just finished listening to the audio version online, and it is amazing.
Wow.
Had me tearful at some points as well.
Oh,
Um,
really?
yeah, it did.
That's good.
And
I haven't met anyone who has listened rather to the audiobooks. I did. I thought I might have overdone it a little bit at some point. So here and yeah, okay, that's good to know.
no, it was really great to listen to, and also the voice, how you bring so much different energy to the different characters as well. It felt amazing. Um, and you mentioned in the play the themes of um, female revenge as well. So a little bit touching on gender.
Yeah.
Um, is that common to some of your other plays and works and poetry as well? Or can you tell us more
Um,
about?
to a certain extent, I write a lot or on my work, either directly or indirectly, and interrogate the idea of gender norms, what men do, what women do, why it is said that they do these things, what stereotypes and falsifications are in and built into that, but largely the destruction that does to society. I think all that sort of penetrates and is visible and is explored in many facets of my work. A lot in poetry. My last play, Barbershop Chronicles, did that a lot. I've got a rainfall did that, and the next play I'm writing is called Three Sisters, which is a classic Chekhov play, which I'm rewriting. So the three sisters in that definitely struggle against the things they're supposed to be doing rather than who they are. And the play after that I'm working on, which is a new version of Antigone, also questions question that, what it means to be a woman in a city like London.
Okay.
So yeah, a lot, really looking at gender norms, and interrogating them is a part of my lexicon, part of the language which I use to sort of to discuss or dissect the world. And I think it's because I have three sisters, and I grew up in a house dominated by women, and I never thought of them as gendered beings. They were just the other kids I grew up with, and I did the things that they did in the house, which meant that I played with dolls and I played with those sort of things that are still associated with femininity, but which I did as a boy, and not thinking they were what women should do or girls should do. They were just what my sisters were doing. And likewise, my sister played with the toys that I was playing. I never questioned their gender because they were doing the things that I was doing. We just did it as kids. So maybe because I grew up in that household, and when I left that and began to realize that the world thought certain things about men or women, boys or girls, was when I began to interrogate it. Yeah.
And then you mentioned as well about Barbershop Chronicles, which is definitely a really in-depth look at masculinity. What,
Mm.
but it's masculinity from different voices set in a barbershop, right? So
Yeah.
you start, and these are conversations that you recorded across different countries, across
Yeah.
Africa.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some the conversations are recorded in barbershops. Sometimes there were conversations that recorded around barbershops. Sometimes there were conversations I had with friends of mine, which I then reset in barbershops. But I had already heard strands of similar conversations in barbershops. So I recorded about 50% of the play is recorded, and about another 50 is things that I made up and characters that I merged together. Sometimes I renamed characters who I had been in the recording as other people, and took myself out of the play. So it's a hodgepodge of people I met and conversations I've been having with myself and with other male friends of mine.
Is there one conversation in particular that sticks in your mind?
Yes, but it didn't make it into the play
Ah,
because
interesting.
yeah, it was one in Kenya. I met this lovely man. I think his name was Brian. And I think he was having marital problems at home, and he didn't want to go back home. So we just ended up speaking for maybe 2 hours after the barbershop had shut. We met in the barbershop and just kept on speaking. And we were talking a lot about Mount Kenya. And he asked me who discovered Mount Kenya, and I told him I didn't know. And he told me that the Kenyan textbooks say that a guy called Johann Krampf, this European explorer, discovered Mount Kenya. And I said, okay, well, thanks for letting me know. And I began to write it down. Then he laughed and told me how implausible that might have been, because he had ancestors who were grazing cattle on that very mountain. So they were there before this European explorer's great grandfather existed. So the textbooks are teaching a Eurocentric syllabus rather than an Afrocentric syllabus. And he talked about just colonization through education, and how across the African continent, and specifically Kenya, because he was Kenyan, we drastically need to rewrite our textbooks and teach the truth and the world as Africans see it, rather than the world as European colonizers invented it. Yeah,
Totally.
it was very funny, the conversation, but it didn't make it into the play. Yeah.
No, but that's a really relevant point, especially to us here at the British Council. We're in the middle of Diversity Week right now, and we're focusing on race and culture because it's often we find a subject that in teaching gets left behind, or people are a little bit scared about talking about.
Mm.
Um, did you find then growing up for you, was race and culture play a big part in how you identify?
Um, Not in how I identified, rather in how I saw other people trying to identify me.
Okay.
I grew up in Nigeria, and I left with a pretty solid sense of my self-worth. And I came with my family, and that sense of self-worth only deepened with my family. And it was only when I got to school and the first students were racist towards me that I realized racism existed. But even then, I just thought it was stupid, and um, and some sort of a mental deficiency to think someone was less than because of the color of their skin or their language. Because, and maybe it's because of how multicultural Nigeria is. We have 500 languages, and I went to a boarding school where I couldn't understand what most of my classmates were speaking unless they switched to English. And even then, they spoke with Englishes that were heavily accented from their own local dialects and languages. So I never thought they were beneath me because they didn't sound like I did or because they didn't look like I did. So coming to London to British school and seeing students did that to me made me think they were stupid as opposed to think that I was less than. So I was aware of the politics of race and the social hierarchies inbuilt, and I was aware of the pecking order I was supposed to slot into, but I rejected all of it. So, which is why I was aware of racism, but it never really affected me. I never thought of, and it never affected my own self-worth or my confidence.
I love this one thing that you said in I think it was in your TED talk about when you in Nigeria, you saw you were a man, but then once
Yeah,
you came to the UK, you were a black man.
yeah,
It's for me that is very telling comment that the race is more prevalent, like how it exists as a machine to try and um, label and categorize people in different ways, and like you say, at times use it to look down on people.
yeah. The interesting thing is the reverse works. When white or Caucasian British men go to Nigeria, for instance, they become white men. So it works the other way around. They stop being men and become white men. But the difference is the legacy of colonization and power, which is what underlines racism, and that's when it becomes a problem. Um, Black Africans, dark skinned Nigerians will not think a white man is beneath them because of the color of his skin, whereas white people think so about people who are not white, and that's where power and comes into the equation, and that's when racism becomes a problem, because we are, being a minority isn't the problem, is the power to affect the prejudice weighed against minorities. That's the problem.
Yeah, the power plus power privilege and how
Yeah.
you identify kind of
Yeah.
dynamic. Um, I just also wanted to talk a little bit more about your how you managed to get to the level of success that you have achieved with sellout runs at the National Theatre. On Friday, we're interviewing the lead singer from Churches as part of our hashtag We Are Equals project. And I was
Mhm.
wondering, is there another project or anything similar, like an initiative, that helped you gain such success?
The very first thing was with the poetry organization called Apples and Snakes.
Yeah.
And they had a very small scheme, which was to get poets to write longer pieces of work. And they paid me a small chunk of money, and I extended a poem that I extended initially a set of poems which had been published previously in my first book into a monologue, which lasted 15 minutes long. And because I won that competition, I was commissioned to write a longer thing, and that became my very first ever play, The 14th Tale. And then I wrote 3 or 4 other one-man shows, the last of which was called Black T-shirt Collection, which ran at the National Theatre in 2012. Then that was my first relationship with the National Theatre. No, my second, The 14th Tale, later transferred to the National. And that's when I began to write even bigger plays. And the Barbershop Chronicles came to the National 3 years. Oh no, wow, 5 years after. Wow, 5 years after that. So it all started with Apples and Snakes and just doing things of my own accord, coming up with bigger, more elaborate stories and trying to get them on stages somewhere.
It's, it's amazing. And just one final question before we have to go. So you're coming over to the Hay Festival in Segovia in September with the British Council,
Yes.
and um, we have so many students and aspiring writers here at the British Council. Do you have any tips or any words for them to help
Um,
them achieve?
the main tip, I two things. One is that the main tip is this: to always be your weird and your quirky self. to hold on to the ways, the particular lenses through which you see the world, however skewed or however wrong you are, to hold that, because that is what makes you different from other writers. If people want a play that sounds like Shakespeare, they'll go to Shakespeare. If you want a play that sounds like, something like a novel written by Neil Gaiman, they'll go to Neil Gaiman. If they want an Inua Ellams poem, they will come to me, right? And so what the task of every writer is to sound like themselves and to create a tunnel through which all their experiences is funneled towards that singular, clear, distinct voice. And that comes from just introspection, knowing who you are, where you've come from, how you see the world, why you see the world that way, and guarding that, regardless of whichever, writing, residencies you go through, just taking what you can, but remember to be yourself. Even Shakespeare said, this above else, to thine own self be true. And that's the most important thing. Just be yourself unashamedly.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. I wish we had more time to speak to you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Thank you.